further the university's mission by disseminating the knowledge and the research at the highest level of excellence. In 2012, the India office became the third publishing center after the New York and Cambridge office. We are a young publisher in India, and works like Sumantra Bose, Secular States, Religious Politics, India, Turkey, and the Future of Secularism give us hope and motivation for creating an outstanding list. A book on the future of secularism in the contemporary India and Turkey features at the top of the wish list for the most of the academic publishers, and we are glad to have this as a part of our list. It explains the origin, evolution, and decline of the secularism as a core principle of the state in India and Turkey. So we have with us today Professor Hamid Ansari, former Vice President of India, Rajeev, Bhargava, Professor and former Director, Center for the Study of Developing Societies, Sumantra Bose, Professor of International and Comparative Politics, London School of Economics and Political Science. So now I request Professor Bose to talk about the book.
I'm needless to say, honored by Hamid Ansari's presence here, and I'm equally delighted that Professor Rajeev Bhargava, whom I've known until today only through his work, agreed to join this occasion. The way the next hour or so is going to run is like this. I'll start off by sharing with you why I wrote this book, why on this particular topic, why this comparison. I'll be relatively brief. After that, Hamid Ansari will speak to the themes of the book that he considers in any way relevant and significant. I know he's given it a very careful reading. And after that, once Mr. Ansari finishes, Professor Bhargava will do the same from perhaps a more academic, strictly academic viewpoint. Thereafter, I will respond briefly to some of the points they raised, and then we'll throw the floor open. We'll have at least a half an hour, I hope, of Q&A with the audience, interactive discussion. So the short answer to why I wrote this book is that I belong to the generation that grew up in India during the crucial decade of the 1980s, witnessing at first hand the erosion and decline of the Indian secular state and the retreat, if not the total downfall, of secularism as a core principle of our polity. Anecdotally, I still remember the fear on the faces of Sikhs in my hometown, Calcutta, in the first days of November 1984. In the late 1980s, I went to the United States for higher studies, and I remember on the morning of 6th December 1992, a friend of mine, who actually is a well-known journalist in Delhi today, journalist, activist, I should say, called me up in my small student flat in New York, Morningside Heights, Columbia University, to inform me that the Babri Masjid had been razed. And morning of 6th December, because of the time difference, of course, with New York, US Eastern Standard Time. And for a moment I thought that he was playing a prank on me to get me out of bed, because people who know me well know that I don't wake up very easily in the mornings. But it wasn't a prank, of course. So I watched the further erosion and decline of the secular state and of secularism as a core principle of our polity unfold through the 1990s and beyond. And really it was something that interested me a great deal, because I know it to be a make and break issue, perhaps the make and break issue today for the future of our republic. Regarding Turkey, I have a long-standing interest in Turkey, which originated through my interest in the Kurdish ethno-nationalist revolt against the Turkish state, which took the form of an armed insurgency from the mid-1980s onwards. That insurgency peaked during the 1990s, especially the first half of the 1990s. Because I happen to work a lot, since that time until today, on conflicts between states and aggrieved groups, therein, I took an interest, a fairly close interest, albeit from a non-specialist perspective in that particular case. And gradually I realized as the 90s wore on that I could make sense of that particular conflict only by understanding the nature and history of the Turkish Republic that was established in the 1920s. And in the process, by the late 1990s, I explicitly realized something that I had known only vaguely before, that this was the other major non-Western example of a republic, albeit established a quarter century before ours, which had loudly proclaimed secularism, or strictly speaking in the Turkish case, laicism, laiklik, to be a central element, to be a pillar of its identity since its formation. And of course, by the late 1990s, the secular state of Turkey was also under challenge. There are various chapters, there are 7 chapters in all in the book, and there is one chapter, because I wrote the book only last year, so it's quite up-to-date, current, Turkey, the anti-secularist triumph, whereas the corresponding India chapter is titled India, the anti-secularist ascendancy. Whether or not it turns into a triumph remains to be seen. As way back as 2000, I decided to do a comparative study of the non-Western secular state and its travails in India and Turkey, and wrote up a book proposal to that effect. This was shortly after I finished my PhD at Columbia University and joined the LSE as a faculty member. But then I never got around to it because many other non-academic and academic preoccupations intervened. It was only 3 years ago, exactly 3 years ago, in July 2015, that literally one fine morning, it occurred to me that this comparative study of secularism and the secular state in India and Turkey, which I had neglected to pursue 15 years earlier, was now even more topical than it was back then. This was in July 2015. So I literally retrieved the old book proposal from 15 years earlier, dusted it off, and began afresh with a revised version. A word on methodology, methodology of comparison, in a way that should be intelligible to everybody here, academics and non-academics alike. This is what would be known in social science as a very small n comparison. It's a paired comparison, of 2 cases, juxtaposed against each other. It makes sense to compare 2 cases which are somewhat similar and somewhat different. Only then is the logic of comparison met or fulfilled. In other words, it makes no sense to compare things that are completely identical because they are carbon copies of each other. At the same time, it doesn't make sense to compare cases which are very, very different, comparing apples and oranges, so to speak. So India and Turkey are similar in the sense that they are the two exemplars of non-Western secular states of the 20th century, both of which have faced erosion and decline as secularism-based polities over time. But on the other hand, there are very significant, even remarkable differences between the specific characteristics and historical and political contexts of the two cases. And this is extremely important. These differences are highlighted, emphasized in the book as much as the core or basic similarities, and lends itself to my conclusion that the future of secularism may in fact be different, indeed significantly brighter in India than has turned out to be in the case of Turkey. The second point I want to make about the methodology of comparison is that I've lost my chain of thought, so probably I'll come back to it at some later point. But I think I've told you enough about my motivations for writing the book. It's been in gestation for an unusually long time, at the back of my mind, in my head, for the last 20 years. So I'm happy that it has finally come to fruition and is seeing the light of day. Thank you very much to Cambridge University Press for putting this out in India and globally. And I'd particularly like to mention Qudsiya Ahmed, the editorial head of Cambridge, India, for the social sciences and humanities. So thank you very much while as I wrap up this kind of introductory preamble. And may I now request Hamid Ansari to speak on the book and its themes as he sees fit.
Ladies and gentlemen, there are three categories of human beings who don't need a script to speak: professors, orators, and I belong to none of these. So, with your permission and with your permission, I shall use a script.
Please.
This is an unusual book. It is a study of two states, their systems of governance, not in terms of institutions, but in the evolution of their ideologies and their underpinnings. Hence the title, Secular States, who at different points of time in the 20th century opted for secularism as an intrinsic principle of governance. There are similarities and there are differences. The book traces the origins and the impulses that propelled these two states. I begin with Turkey. Defeated in World War I, losing an empire and focused on creation of a nation state and on modernization in European terms, aimed at closer integration with Europe. Turkey adopted the principle of laicism, called it secularism, and imposed it on a more or less homogeneous population of Muslims deeply traditional in their daily lives. Hence the emphasis on external manifestations of dress and appearance, and the resultant debate on the headscarf. The book diligently traces the challenges in society and in polity as they develop over decades, intertwined with political changes involving democracy, dictatorship, and authoritarianism. The author rightly observes that the perennial problem with Turkish secularism has been its symbiosis with authoritarianism. Record shows that the emergence of authoritarian governance in Turkey has facilitated the drift away from secularism. In the case of India, there is a plural society of immense diversity throughout its long history. We took this plurality as an existential reality and gave it through the constitution a democratic state structure premised on equality and fraternity, with secularism as an essential ingredient focused on symmetric treatment of different religious communities, on defense of minority rights, and on prevention of bigotry. On India's track record, the author observes that the Indian secular state has been most compromised and damaged, not by any widespread rejection amongst the ordinary Indians of the deeply rooted as well as pragmatic everyday ethics of tolerance, mutual respect, and coexistence of faiths, but it has been compromised by the elites and leaders who have sworn by the principles of secularism. He gives examples of compromises made and opines that the future of secularism in India rests on the capacity of Indian secularists to address the, as he puts it, the contradictions and frailties that have emerged in practice and which have benefited the proponents of Hindutva despite their limited numbers. Religion, as we all know, is a lethal weapon. The book records a remark of Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose to a group of INA soldiers in 1942 that, and I quote, "If you use religion to unite yourself today, you leave the door open for someone to attempt later to divide you using the same sentiment." That's the end of quote. Hence Netaji's insistence on the need to premise Indian unity on sentiments other than religious affiliation. And his one example of it was the slogan he coined, Jai Hind. The challenge before the advocates of secularism as a constitutional value today is to focus on its contradictions and frailties and improve its framework. It is doable but not painless. The alternative of a non-secular state would impinge on both equality and fraternity, and thereby on the very idea of justice as a primary social virtue. I think a single reading of this scholarly work does not suffice, and I, for one, intend to go back to it again and again. Thank you very much, Professor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ansari, for your kind words and very thoughtful words. I could not agree more with your conclusion. Very well put as well. Before I turn the mic over to Professor Bhargava, I've remembered, what I forgot about comparative methodology. So let me just come back to that for a second. Apart from fulfilling the logic of comparison in the way I outlined, there should be some payoff from the comparison. In other words, some insights should be generated, certain arguments should emerge from the comparison that would otherwise not be the case. In other words, there must be some insights generated, some arguments emerging from this comparison that would not be achieved by just looking at India or by just looking at Turkey. That's the payoff of the comparison, and I've tried to do that in this book, and perhaps Professor Bhargava will be able to address that a bit more. I don't know. Just one comment on pluralism and diversity as a social fact. Of course, India's pluralism and diversity is unparalleled, of any country in the world. We all know that, and in that sense, there's no comparison with Turkey, whether the scale of size or the scale of sheer diversity. We have 15 times the population that Turkey does, and so on. However, the common kind of notion that Turkey is quote-unquote 99% Muslim actually obscures a great deal of complexity, differentiation, pluralism and diversity that does exist in a society, in the same way that the not inaccurate but simplistic notion that India is 80% Hindu obscures the scale of diversity and pluralism in our society. So Turkey is in fact rife with ethnic, denominational, sect and ideological diversity. It's a very, very kind of politically divided society, and that reflects, I think, underlying social fractures of long-standing. One final comment on Mr. Ansari's words, and then I'll turn it over to Professor Bhargava to take us forward. I do think that the onus is really on secularists to revive Indian secularism. One of the things that I say in the book, and I'm glad you agree, Mr. Ansari, is that simply reciting the old shibboleths of secular nationalism or uncritically defending what I call in the book the really existing Indian secular state as opposed to an ideal will not suffice in the era of the second coming of Hindutva, which I call in the book Hindutva 2.0 in the Modi-Shah era. So there's a lot of onus on secularists, as Mr. Ansari said, to revive Indian secularism and address the many real contradictions, anomalies, frailties of the really existing Indian secular state in order to make sure that the anti-secular transformation that has unfolded in Turkey over the last 15 years or so is not repeated in India in the next decade or so. Professor Bhargava, over to you.
Thank you very much, Professor Bose. Must congratulate you for a very fine book. It's well researched, it's carefully argued, it's conceptually sound, extremely lucid, unbiased. It's got a very strong chapter in Kashmir, which I particularly appreciate. So I highly recommend the book to all of you. Here I shall underplay my agreements with you, and there are lots of points on which I agree. For example, you said that the practice of secular state in India is flawed. Ansari Saab has already said that the reason for its failures is not because it's been rejected by the people at large, but because of compromises made by the secular elite. I largely agree with that. It's also severely damaged by Hindutva forces, not least because its rejection is at the very heart of the movement and its ideology. I think you're right that the Kashmir is a blot on Indian democracy and in Indian secularism, and that maybe this is a trifle exaggerated for the early period, but certainly one can say that the kind of secularism that is practiced there is authoritarian. Although I think this remark that you quote from Sheikh Abdullah, I beg your pardon, Sheikh Abdullah, that Indian secularism and Indian democracy stopped at Banihal. I think the reasons for that lie not just with the scenario and the Congress party at that time, but I think Mr. Abdullah should also take some blame for it. And I think that is something that we need to examine a little more. I think you are also, overall, I agree with your conclusion that although the pan-Indian BJP hegemony that the Hindutva movement is striving for is not assured, it is, all things considered, and that's, I'm quoting you, advantage at the moment. And a lot hinges on how politicians who are serious about secularism and intellectuals and ideologues, how they conduct themselves in the near future. That's going to decide the fate of secularism. On all of this, I have agreements with you. But I'm going to just talk about the disagreements and what I consider to be points where we could have. I'm going to state them reasonably provocatively to get people to discuss these issues. So first of all, about the characterization of Indian secularism. So I completely agree that it is quite different from the Western model, and in fact that's been the whole point of some of my work in the last 25 years, to show how distinctive it is and how it is distinguished from the Western model. And you rightly say that we do not have anything like the wall of separation. I mean, if the conceptual structure of secularism is that the state must separate itself from religion in some way, then the way we understand separation is not, having a strict separation between religion and state, erecting a wall of separation and so on. That's correct. You also say that we should have neutrality, particularly because we are, after all, a country where a lot of religions exist, and even in these religions there's a great deal of internal differentiation. So neutrality is absolutely important. And that's, again, something that probably is common with many other liberal democratic states. But you say that what makes India and Turkey different is that the state in India and in Turkey has enormous powers to regulate religion. That's the difference between, say, the Western model and the Indian and Turkish model. This, I think, is only half true, and even probably a bit wrong, because, the whole French conception is based entirely on this model. It's the control model. They interpret separation not to mean strict separation between state and religion, not mutual exclusion of state and religion, but the idea that religion must be separated from the state, but the state retains the power to control and regulate religion. And that's how you privatize religion, which is, of course, absolutely central to French philosophy. So while regulation distinguishes, the idea of regulating religion distinguishes India and Turkey from American model, ideal typical American model, because in practice, of course, things are a bit different. It doesn't distinguish, these don't distinguish, this particular thing of regulation doesn't distinguish India from, say, France. And since France is a very important model within the Western conception, that's not what distinguishes. That's the first point. So what is it that does distinguish? I think regulation has always got this, anti-religious propensity that kind of hinder religion. But what is important in neutrality in some ways is not just that you hinder religion in some ways, or you prevent religion from doing whatever it is that it's meant to do freely, but also to help religion, right? And the idea of neutrality is that you help or hinder in an impartial way. Now, the help bit is very important in the Indian model. We do facilitate religion. I mean, for example, the state, there's a constitutional right for every religious community that runs an education institution to ask for funding from the state, whether it is Hindus or Muslims or Christians or Parsis or Jains. All of them can ask for it. And of course, there is, for particular religious and linguistic minorities, you have a constitutional mandatory right for them. So this is a straightforward, positive recognition of religion, and also a help that the state gives to religion. And it's this very peculiar balancing act that Indian secularism has to do between hindering and helping, which is what is very peculiar to India, unlike, say, the American model, where you cannot help or hinder, and unlike the French ideal to the model, where you only hinder, but actually are not supposed to help. I mean, after 1905, no state funding is available to any place of religious worship, right? So all the churches, of course, this leads to a lot of institutional biases, because all the major churches in France are built before 1905. So the state is funding all of them, and there are millions of such churches. But no new place of worship can be funded, which means that if a Muslim or a Sikh or if any other, they want to build something there, the state is not going to help them. But that's not the case in India, that's those kind of. So I think that's important to keep in mind. I mean, so before we start saying that this model is being attacked or is crumbling, we must know what exactly it is. It's not the French, it's not the American. This is only one particular feature that I mentioned, which distinguishes it from the French or the Indian model. But there are more. There is a phrase, actually the word which Hamid used, fraternity. These models, the Western models of secularism, are all oriented. It's not that they separate religion and state for no value. There is a value which is constitutive to the separation. But they do it for freedom and equality, understood purely individualistically. So it's individual freedom, individual equality. In India, of course, it's not just, it is individualistic. There are a lot of individual freedoms and a lot of, there's equality between and among individuals that is served by some kind of separation, but there's also some community-oriented rights.
Very much so.
But more importantly, so you mentioned minority rights, but more importantly, and even if this is not explicitly mentioned in the Constitution, it's certainly implicit in it, but certainly very much part of the discourse of India, which is that the state is meant to encourage a certain quality of sociability, not only between individuals, but also more particularly between religious communities. So there is, and we have a phrase for it, communal harmony. It's harmony. And anything that prevents that from happening, the state is meant to discourage. And this is nowhere in any of the Western models. And there is a reason for that. And I come to my other point. I think the Western conception that you have outlined, again, is has something inadequate about it, in my view. And the reason is that, I'll put it very briefly because this is a very complex and very complicated issue, but the Western secularism emerged. Secularism in the West emerged after a lot of religious homogenization had taken place, right? So you had predominantly single religion societies. In fact, you had confessional societies which meant that every state had the prince of every state, or the princess or queen of every state at that time, had already confessed, publicly pronounced, that he or she is going to favor one particular church. So, and that church and this state were very strongly aligned with one another. So these were all confessional states. And there were ethically undesirable ways in which this homogenization was accomplished. People were thrown out, expelled, or exterminated. And those who were left within the territory had to live not a public but a completely private existence. And that's what toleration meant. And so the first, you had these very strong connections between the state and the church. And once people began to realize that this one church in their society, that church had become politically very meddlesome and socially very oppressive, then the battle against the church started and a lot of unchurching movements began. So hence the idea of church-state separation. But these are predominantly single religion societies, in religiously homogeneous societies. Now this is not something that happened ever in India in its history. And the first time it's happened, as we know, attempted, is 1947, when this kind of European model of religion, state, and all that, and nation state was brought over a period of time, and you had an attempt at religious homogenization. So religious diversity is something which is not an optional extra in India. It's always part of our background. And our secularism arose in response to that religious diversity, not in religiously homogeneous societies. And that makes a huge difference to the kind of secularism we have and the kind of impartiality we have, the impartial structures that we've designed, and so on. I think I've spoken quite a lot already. There is a whole issue about the Turkish and Indian, the authoritarian versus democratic, and I really like to go into that, but I don't think I have the time to do that. Let me just come to this issue about hindering, religion, and the argument that is made by a lot of people that the state has intervened negatively negatively in Hindu religion, but not in Muslim or other religious communities. That's the strong argument against uniform civil code. But as you yourself point out, by quoting K.V. Kripalani, that this is not anti-Hindu. It's actually pro-Hindu. Kripalani rightly argued that this reform that was undertaken is for the benefit of Hindus. And likewise, if Muslims have been left out of this reform, that is not to their benefit, but in some ways it's a loss to them. The state has not acted in favor of Muslims. The state, in fact, has acted against Muslims by leaving them from these equality and freedom-centered reforms. And the only people who have suffered, as you rightly, you probably mentioned, but Kripalani doesn't, but Nehru said, that the people who have been really excluded from reform and the worst sufferers of the failure of the reform are Muslim women. So I don't know what Hindus have to complain about it. We've achieved a lot as Hindus in this country from these reforms, but Muslims likewise haven't. And I do think that that there should be attempts made. I think Nehru at that time said that this is the start. We are preparing the ground for it. And I think you pointed out rightly that they probably should have done something about it by in 10 years' time. I don't think the argument that we shouldn't reform anything in Hindus unless it's also done in Muslims is completely faulty. Nothing happens like that. You seize an opportunity when it is available to reform something, and then you move to reforming something else. So it couldn't have happened simultaneously, but yes, in 10, 15 years' time, greater work should have been done, and Muslim personal law should be, from a particular vantage point, that is gender justice in particular, should have been done, and we've permanently deferred it. We should have, the delay is understandable, the deferment is not, and that is one of the that's come to be a big sort of noose around the neck of Indian secularists, and I think we are perfectly. You have a very good discussion, and I have lots of things to say about it, ideological origins of secularism in India, but I don't think we have the time for it. Let me just come to the last point, which is to do with what secularists need to do in order to, because I think the point is not just the practice of secularism is flawed, that it is secular state. But I think we have not put out the best case for secularism. We have often confused it with the Western model, with we privatize religion or separate, create a wall of separation and so on. And these kind of Western text-oriented models have been occupying our minds for too long, particularly among the left. But I think there are three things that we must, at least I've got a long list here, three things which we need to do. First of all, I think it's wrong to let secularism be identified with simply a defense of minority rights. That's happened in India, and I think it's very it's deeply mistaken. This is only part of the story. One of the equally important functions of secularism is to ensure that every religious person and every religious group is protected from, and here I'm in complete agreement with Hamid, from the bigots and extremists of their own religion, right? And there are all sorts of ways in which members of a religious community oppress and exploit members of their own community, and that intra-religious dimension of this whole issue, particularly how to address the problem of caste and the problem of women. I mean, that is something that is very much a part of the secularist project. It is, secularism, it doesn't deal only with inter-religious issues. That's important, and it has to be, that is the Indian thing to do. But the other issue is as important, and to neglect it and not to keep foregrounding it as we talk about inter-religious issues has been a very big problem. Number two, I think it's, we fail to make a distinction between a communitarian standpoint and a communal standpoint. It's one thing, there's nothing wrong being in defending your community, whether it is your linguistic community or your religious community. There's nothing wrong with thinking of your the sense of self that you have as related to, and in some ways as even defined by, your community, and to take legitimate pride in that. Legitimate pride, which also means shame when it's required. There's nothing wrong with that, it's important. But doing that is not the same as being communal. Communal is when you defend something, an act of your community, or you do something on behalf of the community, always at the expense of another community, to put it very crudely. And I think this very often the distinction between communitarian and communal has not been maintained, and every time, and this is particularly with people who have so-called, I don't know whether they're practicing Hindus or not, but people with Hindu names have a particular problem. They have not had the language to know your traditions much better. We neither know, Muslims don't know the traditions of Hindus do not know the traditions of Muslims. I don't think they're completely illiterate about each other, and we are constantly defending, each other's religions, or at least some people are, and I think that is shallow, and I think that has also been one of the major problems of why Indian secularism is at the ideological level, mind you, only that intellectual ideological level, why it is sort of shaky today. I could go on, but I think I better stop here. Have said enough.
Very rich intervention, I thought, wealth of insights. I agree with much of your criticism and with much of your final three conclusions. The only notion that I would warn against is the notion that is peddled quite systematically that Indian secularism is Western-inspired. I do not believe that to be true. One of the reasons that, although the fate of the Indian secular state hangs in the balance as we speak, while the Turkish secular state as established by Ataturk is dead in all but name, replaced by kind of an alternative Hanafi Sunni conception of majoritarian conception of Turkish national identity, it's because Indian secularism, with all its contradictions and anomalies, is far more culturally authentic. Has far stronger indigenous roots than the Turkish counterpart. Very broadly speaking, there were two sets of justifications, given by our various, founding fathers, and they were fathers; they were almost all men. So for what became the de facto Indian secular state from 1950 onwards, although the word did not feature in the Constitution until 1976, as we know, and it was very interesting that. Secularism, secular state became a staple of Indian official discourse from the early 1950s onwards, while those terms were very rarely used in the discourse of the Indian independence movement, very rarely, by any of the leaders and ideologues. The two sets of justifications are that a secular state is a practical necessity in a multi-religious country. That's the pragmatic argument. And second, it's in keeping with and in continuity with one aspect, not by any means the only aspect, of Indian tradition, which is the everyday ethos, also pragmatic perhaps more than anything else, of tolerance, coexistence between people of different religious faiths. By contrast, there is really no reference to any Western model or any Western inspiration, whatsoever. And this applies as much to Nehru, I think, as anybody else. By contrast, the Turkish secular state was crudely imitative. It borrowed its civil code from the 1912 Civil Code of Switzerland, enacted in 1926. And the objective was not to join the West, not to become like the West or Europe, terms were used interchangeably, but become European, to become Western. I'm glad you raised the issue of France, because that, of course, was the model. But the Turkish secularists, the Kemalist vanguard, were so immersed in their simplistic and even infantile Europhilia that they forgot that the French secular state of the 20th century emerged after more than 100 years of contestation between, say, 1789 and the law of 1905. So it takes time. And the reason it did was that from the late 19th century onwards and into the 20th century, the secular Republicans got more popular support in elections than did the monarchists and clericalists, the conservative side of the social and political spectrum. There are two very big differences which I emphasize again and again between the Indian and Turkish secular states. One is that Indian secularism and the secular state that was established after independence was not, West-inspired. It had authentic roots and, indigenous context that it drew upon. And second, of course, that Indian secularism, official secularism, I should say, developed as part of a flawed but functional democracy, while Turkish state secularism was imposed top-down, using, as you know, and I suspect many other people know, extremely, heavy-handed, draconian methods, and eventually, after 2 or 3 generations, this produced a backlash, blowback. The way I characterize the Erdogan regime is that it's simply taken over the authoritarian, Kemalist state and remolded it. So the bottle is the same. The label on the bottle has been modified to get rid of the military guardianship and the emphasis on secularism or laicism. The portion that is inside the bottle is also somewhat different, of course, but it's as noxious in the sense it's as intolerant of diversity, dissent and opposition as its former Kemalist counterpart. Now, this is not true of India. One can, criticize the Indian secular state in many different ways, but it was not imposed by a political minority on a largely uncomprehending population, because that sort of imposition was not possible. So this is another fiction that is being peddled in the era we live in that should be contested. I'll try to be brief because I think people will want to come in and from the audience. Once you have a secular state that doesn't observe the wall of separation as its basic principle, but is self-infested with enormous constitutional and legal powers to interfere and meddle in the religious domain, whether helping or hindering or a combination of the two. What makes the state secular is, well, it is constitutionally secular. First is that the state's constitutional identity is not based on, tied to, or derived from any religious faith, so it's neutral in that sense. But second, when you have this interventionist regulatory model of the secular state, which India and Turkey have in common, Turkey's version being, I think, as you're quite right, inspired by the French model, which it tries to copy with tragic consequences. What makes these secular republics is the commitment, and again, you're quite right, it's not about individuals, it's actually it is about individuals, but it's more about communities than individuals, to treat all faiths, denominations, confessional identities, sects, what have you, in the spirit of equality, okay? And I would suggest that the problems that afflict the Indian secular state today, in fact, go back to the formative period. Kripalani said, among other things, he said that, why the reform and codification only of Hindu personal and family laws? Because this is violating the spirit and the principle of impartiality, of impartial treatment, that citizens should be treated equally, regardless of whatever religious community or background they belong to. And he said, for example, that today, he's speaking in 1955 or so, 56 maybe, he said that Muslims are more ready for monogamy than Hindus are ready for divorce. So why are Hindus being singled out for preferential treatment? And so on. And then, of course, there were the cow slaughter laws, anti-cow slaughter laws, that were enacted in quick succession in the second half of the 1950s by Congress governments, of course, in Uttar Pradesh first, then in Bihar, Madhya Pradesh, Rajasthan. So cow slaughter became illegal across, practically all of northern India. As you know, some Muslim plaintiffs challenged this in the courts, that it violated, constitutional rights, freedom of religion, religious practice, and but also freedom of occupation, another constitutionally guaranteed right, the butcher trade. And the Supreme Court upheld the laws eventually, dismissed the complaints, mainly on the grounds of that these were reasonable restrictions given the widely prevalent popular sentiment on the issue. And also that cow slaughter was not an essential part of the Muslim faith and so on, but those were somewhat secondary arguments. Then we have, for example, a person who was the Nehru government's Attorney General, M.C. Setalvad. And this is something perhaps even you didn't bring up in your kind of wide-ranging comments. And he gave the Sardar Patel Memorial Lecture in 1966 over 2 days on All India Radio, which was published as a booklet in 1967 called Secularism by the Publications Division of the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting of the Government of India. And there, a state secularist and a top official of the Indian secular state in the 1950s and 1960s, he located the Indian secular state squarely in the uniquely tolerant ethos and Catholic with a small c spirit of Hinduism. Now, maybe this can be debated in the Q&A, but if we accept this romanticized notion of Hindu tolerance, it's uniquely tolerant kind of ethos and nature, which of course is being peddled as well by secularists in defense of the beleaguered Indian secular state. This could logically lead to the conclusion, however, that there is no need for any kind of secular state at all. India can simply be a Hindu state in which the uniquely tolerant virtues of Hinduism will ensure a paradise for all, whether Hindus or non-Hindus, alike. So this is something I think that needs to be questioned as well, without demeaning the great faith of Hinduism in any way. I'm almost done, then you can come in. Finally, of course, there were these founding anomalies, when challenged not just by Hindu nationalists, but actually more by secularist critics in Parliament, on why the government was not, why the government of the day was not trying to progress Article 44, Uniform Civil Code, but rather doing things that were leading in the opposite direction. I think Nehru himself said that, the time is not ripe for it yet. I wish the time were ripe, but it is not. And it's turned out the time is not ripe, it never became ripe. And his law minister, H.V. Patashkar, said that, these new codified reformed laws, enacted in the name of welfare and progress and the social good, will apply to nearly 85% of the population. Therefore, this is a start. And then about the other 15%, we'll see later. But this doesn't resolve the basic contradiction. And then finally, this has been referred to a number of times before, that in the 1980s we had this unfortunate phenomenon of Indian secularism being reduced to the parallel appeasement of dubious demands being raised in the names of both Hindus and Muslims. The Ayodhya Mosque on the one hand and the Shah Banu case on the other. This is very well known. But I would like to have a bit more discussion on the nature of the state. Is it a really secular state? The main minority in Turkey, they are a particularly heterodox offshoot of Shiism. They're heterodox even in comparison to more mainstream versions of Shiism, Alevis. They are up to 20% of the population, mostly Turks, but also Kurds. And they strongly supported the Kemalist secular state for obvious reasons. However, they feel that they were used as a vote bank for many decades. that true equality was not given to them, and that almost throughout the Kemalist Republic, except perhaps the 1930s, 1940s, the heyday of enforced, top-down state secularism, the Turkish secular state harbored an very deeply ingrained, insidious partiality towards the Hanafi Sunni identity of the majority. So whether something of that nature is true or not, perhaps should be debated more. In terms of the control model, the main government agency for controlling the religious domain in Turkey was, of course, the Diyanet, the Directorate General of Religious Affairs. India doesn't have an exact equivalent, never has. And the Diyanet was actually set up on the very day, March 3rd, 1924, that the Caliphate was abolished by the newly formed republic. Now, the Diyanet was set up to supervise and control religion under the rubric of the secular state. But from the 1970s onwards, and certainly from the 1980s onwards, when the Turkish military started propagating this new ideology of a Turkish Islamic synthesis, which is pretty much the ideology that the Erdogan regime stands for today, 30 years later. From that time onwards, the Diyanet actually became a vehicle for the promotion of the majority conception of religion in Turkey, the Hanafi Sunni Turkish conception. So I'll stop there, and Hamid Saab would like to say something, and then we'll have a bit of Q&A at least.
No, my only question was how much of this explains away the actual practice that developed, in the Indian case. What Mr. Kripalani said in 55 was that to reinforce the principle of secularism or delay a set of rules and regulations that he was not very positive about. And I think that is a question that we need to ask ourselves again and again when we talk about how much of it is motivated by advocacy of a principle and how much of it is simply there to explain away a situation which we have not been able to tackle. I take the classic case of a uniform civil code. It's been talked about ad infinitum. Best of my knowledge, to this day, no set of legal luminaries have produced a code for discussion. I may be wrong, but this is what I understand. Because a civil code basically deals with 4 or 5 things. It deals with marriage, divorce, inheritance, adoption, and all related matters. The reality is such for each one of these things. If you are willing to accept marriage and divorce, which is probably becoming much easier in modern times through the civil regulatory system, are you willing to accept inheritance on that system? The answer would be squarely no, for whatever reason. So we have a genuine difficulty as to how to proceed. But faced with that difficulty, which is real, what can we do in the societal plane for a uniform application of a set of broad principles of what we intend by Indian version of secularism? But there is a thought in my mind. I am looking for answers. I hope somebody will be able to enlighten me. Thank you.
Great. I'd like to open the floor to comments and questions. Of course, please identify yourself and keep it very brief to the point. Yeah.
I want to make 2 points and then the outlandish statement. The 2 point is that all of you agree that Indian secularism is an indigenous root and it is not inspired by the Western society. Yes. You completely forget that Indian state was an inherited colonial state. It's the colonial state in India which was secular. And after partition, the Nubian elite believed that they will be able to manage in the same way as the colonial state has managed and played around with different communities in this country. Indian secularism is highly inspired and based on the assumptions of the colonial state. And once partition has occurred, it was very difficult to withstand any secularism by the state. When the state began to retreat, Nehru launched this secular project through the elite, which I need not go to. At the very beginning of foundation of Indian situation, 5 things happened simultaneously, which people consider separate. These 5 things are: number 1, construction of the temple of Somnath; number 2, placing the idols at Ayodhya; number 3, Hindi as the language; number 4, cow protection in the constitution; number 5 is the uniform civil code in the constitution. Where is the state and constitution are being made secular? And totally, you pick up one thing in the constitution, leave others, and there is the unified. And I feel bewildered when people talk of Nehruvian and they forget what was being done by Munshi, Patel and Rajinder Prasad. Just read their ideas and their practice. Then you will see Nehru was totally superficial, retreating in front of their onslaught, not able to defend himself at all. And at one point he said, "I'm willing to resign," when he got defeated by them. I mean, it's remarkable how our Indian elite have conspired with the Nehruvian discourse in this country. Now the outlandish statement. The outlandish statement.
Sir, we need to give other people a chance.
Just
please wind up. Yeah.
3 seconds. The outlandish statement is, there is no state in human history, especially in the modern period, whose cultural complexion does not carry the cultural stem of the dominant community. Let me repeat. There is no state in human history, especially in the modern world, which does not carry the cultural stem, whose complexion does not carry the cultural stem of the dominant community. That is the statement. That is the outlandish statement, which rolls out the idea of secularism throughout the world.
Okay, it's a very powerfully articulated point of view. But let's move on to the next question or comment. Yeah.
My name is Manisha Priya. I'm an LSE alum and I teach here now. Got 2 really short questions. One is the method itself, since you took time to articulate that you're going to use parts of the most similar systems type of method, normally used to track developmental trajectories, but here you were looking at certain types of ideas and state systems as they look at the development of these ideas and whether these ideas remain established or not. I think a fine and novel use of the method. Now my question really is that when you're using this, have you also, relatedly used something called comparative historical institutionalism, which would allow you to go back to a founding moment, even in Turkish, as also in Indian secularism, which actually predates the sole domination of Western modernity. In India, as much as in Turkey, there's enough evidence to tell us, for example, that there are pathways to regional modernity. The Kerala example, the Wakam Maulavi example, of which the Vice President, former Vice President, has been a part. Now, the debates happening in West Asia, Abdul Ghani, Rida, much of the press that begins to flourish in Kerala, for example, happens from those sources. And I conclude by saying that the method leading to the substance, the arguments, if we look at regional pathways to modernity, leading up to secular and reformist practices, even within Islam in Kerala, tell us a lot about certain pathways that are not exactly Indian, but were happening in from within West Asian modernity, and much of the influence of the French arguments was actually to incorporate ideas on egalite within the discourse that's happening in West Asia. And the Wakamalvi's reform, for example, of the horrible practices of the mullahs in the Travancore state were inspired by these lineages. So have you, and if you have, will you highlight it?
Yeah. Okay, in the book, I really concentrate on the 20th century and the early 21st century because it has a contemporary focus, which in a way is unfortunate, but this was really for space considerations. The book is almost 400 pages long anyway. And for example, I would have loved to have done more on the 19th century internal debates over reform in the very late Ottoman Empire. And the place of religion vis-a-vis the state, but I couldn't really do that much about it. But the point I will make is that one crucial mistake the Kemalists made was to kind of throw out, in a classic case of throwing the baby out with the bathwater, 1,000 years of Islamic history of Anatolia, which actually predates the Ottomans, because before that the Seljuks were there and so on. And all of this was declared from the 1920s onwards as backward, barbaric, useless, and essentially uncivilized, because the only modernity was Western modernity. The only civilization was European civilization, while our founders generally emphasized continuity with, positive aspects of historical inheritance, something completely different. In 1928, the Indian National Congress appointed a high-level committee to recommend the basic constitutional principles for future free India. The committee was chaired by Motilal Nehru, and its 8 members included Subhash Chandra Bose, then a rising young leader from Bengal. And on this particular matter, the recommendation was, quote unquote, the Commonwealth of India shall have no state religion. And then 3 years later, 1931, I don't think Subhash Chandra Bose can be regarded as a West-oxygenated person or a tool or a pawn of Occidental powers. In 1931, Karachi Resolution again of the Congress, the state shall observe neutrality with regard to all religions. And regarding Gandhi, who we know, religion and politics were two sides of the same coin in his worldview and his political praxis. But he was once famously asked in London by a pompous and probably racist British journalist, Mr. Gandhi, what is your opinion of Western civilization? And Gandhi, paused for a moment and then replied, I think it would be a good idea. That I think sums up the rather skeptical, if not adversarial, attitude of so many of our most important, founders towards the West and its claims to be the sole repository of civilization. I think Rajeev wants to respond.
At some stage, we should respond to Professor Josh's
okay.
But maybe after. I mean, I'd like to engage with him after, maybe at the very end.
Good evening. I'm Ocean, a student of economics. The idea that state facilitates religion, something that we heard right now, I would say should have been an essential part of Indian secularism. But right now, as we see that the amalgamation of religion and the state is going to an extent that is not just limited to election campaigns, but an extent that is shaping the portrayal of leaders, the way we're making policies, the general discourse in the nation. My question to you, noble people, is how do you see secularism going ahead in our country? Do you feel that the idea of the state facilitating secularism can ever be attained? Thank you.
Hamid, sir, or Professor Bhargava.
We will collect the questions. Mani has some.
Mani?
I think a major problem that secularists have is that it was possible to reform Hindu traditions, customs, usages through parliament because the bulk of the members of parliament were Hindus. And as far as I've been able to see from the record, no non-Hindu participated in any significant manner in the discussions on the 5 bills that eventually constituted the Hindu Code Acts. If you try and reform other societies through the same process, you're faced with the problem that our parliament today has only 4% representation of Muslims. So are 96% non-Muslims going to determine what Muslim personal law should be? And this would equally apply to other minorities, such as the Christians, the Parsis, and might even apply to those sects of Hinduism or the larger Hindu family who don't want to be called Hindus, such as the Sikhs, and to some extent the Jains and the Buddhists. And we have the problem of the Lingayats already facing us. So in these circumstances, is the legal route, the parliamentary route, the right route for reforming non-Hindu societies in a country where 85% of the population belongs to the majority religion and 96% of the members of parliament belong to that dominant society? How can we possibly use parliament for the minorities in the same way as we used parliament for the reform of Hindu law?
But is there any other mechanism?
There are
Two more hands up on the right-hand side of the room and one here.
Very good afternoon to everyone. First, I have 2 major concerns. I'm a young girl myself. So, first concern would be, if we have to accept that there will be communal and cultural dominance of the majority, and are we, or should we even be capable enough to use the terminology and vocabularies, secularism? Second, I would like to draw the concern from what Professor Bhargava has pointed out, that is of knowing the religious practices. Currently, the kind of extremism that can be visible, viewed by all of us today, it has, in my opinion, created a certain level of divide in our society, which keeps people from accepting or acknowledging their religious orientation at the expense of not sounding extremist or very politically active. So in that view, I would like to know as to what would be the future of religion and what would be the role that the religion will play in secularism in future. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for this nice session. I am Junaid from South Asian University from Sociology Department. So now my question is, in this 21st century, we see that communism is not the only problem. We have a problem of political violence that caused to the opposition political party and racism and political hatred also. So my question is, how a secular state can face political violence that determined by the political ideologies and racism and as well as political hatred and repression to opposite political person? How a secular state can face? Thank you.
You've already had a chance, right? No? Okay, fine. The last one then. And then we can, we are kind of out of time already. So,
Sirs, my name is Mohd Kathuria. I'm a student at the Saudi department. I just have a simplistic question. It's just that, let's go by the fact that what Gandhiji said, that India lives in its villages. which I feel is very true. There is a huge disconnect between what we consider as academics in our universities at our level and what happens in the villages. If some ideology, some kind of, and let me say at the outset, I do believe in secularism, but the fact is that the real matter that of what I'm trying to say is that the villages are what is constituting the body politic in our society. Now, I don't know about what is to be done. I was just wondering if anybody has any thoughts on how to actually take a very religiously oriented society in the first place and take it towards a very scientific concept that is secularism. If anybody can help in that. Thank you.
I don't think we can take so many.
One last one. Just the last one.
Okay.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Kunal. I'm from ETI, and I have one short question. We are today discussing secularism at a time when the word secular itself has become sort of pejorative term. You go to social media where people are today branded as seculars, literards. We get those terms. I as journalists sometimes, am branded so. So my question is, when we look at the future of secularism at this point, do you think it is threatened at a time when the social media is virtually becoming the battleground? Thank you.
Okay, let's respond. Professor Bhargava first.
Okay.
We should say something in conclusion and then.
So many interesting questions to all of us, and I won't be able to speak on everybody's behalf, and I won't be able to respond to all the questions, but briefly, I don't think the colonial state was secular. I mean, let's take the first half of the 20th century. If, by the standards of Indian secularism, preventing communal tensions and violence was one of the main objectives of the state, which is what I said, promoting communal harmony, degree of sociability, then we know that the record of the colonial state in prevention of communal violence was very poor. No, so number one, no, we can have I have to respond in the way that I think is possible at this time. The other is, this whole idea of individual freedom or equality. I think the emphasis was too much on non-interference in communities. But the state did not want to do anything about, issues of intra-religious domination. I mean, well, the Bentinck and 1829 and, that phase apart. I think the British colonial state decided to keep its hands off any idea of religious interference, in the way in which the Indian secular state began, with the regulations. And so that's one point. I think the point about the point that you made, the outlandish statement that you made, let me just briefly respond to it in the Indian context. I think there is something called a broad social imaginary, a kind of a tacit understanding, which is a background assumption, which throughout Indian history, not that it was not contested, both Brahminical orthodoxy and from time to time, a certain Muslim orthodoxy did contest it. But this broad ethos, and he refers to it as ethic, which I agree, this ethos was of acceptance, not of equal respect, but of acceptance and coexistence. Now, what do we call this ethos? We often, talk about it as an Indian ethos, Indian cultural ethos. But if you really want to call it Hindu, I have no problems. You can call it a Hindu ethos, provided you understand that this Hindu ethos, the Hindu term here, refers both, to, in some sense, to a territory and a very minimal socio-cultural sense. It is nothing to do with modern Hinduism, which is constructed from late 18th, early 19th century. As a matter of fact, modern Hinduism and this social ethos, which you may call Hindu social ethos, are in deep tension with one another, and modern Hinduism is actually in many ways incompatible with it. So it is. We have, there's a lot of people who keep trading on this ambiguity of the word Hindu. You can say that there is Hindu tolerance, but then you'll have to talk about this geographical, socio-cultural notion where a lot of people, even Muslims are a part of it in some ways. The early Christians became a part of it. So this is, you can call it Hindu, and this is a Hindu ethos, and I'm very happy to accept it as one of the foundations of India. There is an alternative word for it, Indian culture, that is also fine. But both of these and modern Hinduism, which is a construct of 19th century, are in deep tension. Modern Hinduism is not a foundation. It's like any other world religion. It's not a foundation of Indian civilization and Indian society. It's foolish to say that because it's something which it cannot be a historical foundation. It's a construction of 18th century.
Nobody says that.
No, anyway,
you're debating against.
I'm not saying that you say it. I'm only saying that there is an argument which is made about what the foundations are, whether Hindu is part of that or not. As long as we are very careful in spelling out what exactly we mean by the term, we can find some agreements. Okay, on this point, the money's point, I think it's if by that logic, nothing which relates to the minorities can ever come to the parliament. The fact is that is obviously not what you're trying to say. I mean, we have to acknowledge, I'm just going to restrict myself to secularism, which is to say, because it's democratic, right? Democratic. Secularism is dependent on multiple agents, not dependent only on what happens in parliament, what happens in judiciary, what happens, in bureaucracy. It's all these multiple state actors are involved, but a lot of other people are involved. Civil society activists, intellectuals, an alert citizenry, the media. I think all of these, in democratic societies, public policy and law have to be shaped by all of these. And therefore, when matters come to the parliament, it's already shaped by a whole variety of people, a variety of actors, including actors from the community. So, I think what is great about the idea of democratic secularism is you're taking religion out of the clutches of the clergy and so-called religious virtuosity. Religion is everybody's concern, and there is no reason why we should just leave it to the mullahs and the pundits. It concerns everybody, and therefore it can come to the parliament, and regardless of whether it's a Muslim issue or a Hindu issue, because it's shaped by everybody. I mean, it's discussed in the newspaper. There are activists in the game people from the community, everybody. Now, this may sound a little idealistic, and in India, it hasn't quite worked that way, but there's no reason why, as you deepen your democracy, as in many other issues related to the, many other things, why this should not happen for religions. I think I'll stop here. There are so many very interesting questions, and perhaps you can...
Well, I don't have very much to say. I have not reached the stage of rewriting history, but I thought history of all colonialism brings out vividly that the objective of the colonialist is to sustain its rule, and therefore one of the ways, the old saying divide and rule, has been the formula for every known colonialism, ancient or modern. So the British were no different. They revised, succeeded brilliantly if you look at the end result. And the second point is that I think when we are talking of reforms, we are studiously ambivalent about matters which fall squarely within the realm of patriarchy. Every social reform or every effort to carry out social reform is focused on some aspect or other of patriarchy. But because we do not want to call a spade, I mean, patriarchy is pervasive. It cuts across, it doesn't differentiate between this or this. And it is so deep-rooted that there is no getting away from it. We've tried successfully, unsuccessfully, less successfully. So if we were to call a spade, I think half the problems of reforms, which we tend to call religious reforms, are really social reforms. Thank you.
I'll just address the last question about abusiveness, particularly but not only on social media. And I think that there's a very simple explanation for this. There is basically a very vocal, highly organized, extremely determined political minority in the country, which, A, feels that its version of Indian nationalism, which arose in the 1920s, alongside what was, until recently, the dominant version of Indian nationalism, that is the only legitimate form of Indian nationalism, the only authentic, culturally authentic, true form of Indian nationalism, rooted in the essence, the majoritarian essence. And B, second, this highly organized, committed political minority believes that its time has finally come, and hence it's pushing the envelope as much as possible. I don't know the prototype for this kind of anti-secular kind of transformation of the republic is actually not Pakistan, which has been a military-dominated state for the last 60 years. Here you can't have a Ziaul Haq coming and imposing Islamization policies, as happened during the 1980s. India is an established and consolidated democracy, so the anti-secular transformation will have to be done in a manner compatible with a highly evolved and complex democratic framework. And the state prototype is actually Israel, or which has been described as an ethnic democracy, a country that has democratic institutions and procedures which are very well established, but enshrines the supremacy and the ownership of one national people. And there are other examples. There's a little island just to the south of our country, which is a country by, for, and of the singular Buddhist majority of the population. There's Croatia in the Balkan region of Europe, which is the national state of the Croatian people, which has ethnically cleansed almost all of its main minority, the Serbs and so on. Will India go the Turkey way? I don't know. There are three kind of big differences. The vastness of not just size, but of the scale of diversity, which is unparalleled. Many would still say that the majoritarian construct on which the ascendant and wannabe hegemonic politics of today is based is a fiction. It doesn't really exist because that majority is way too fragmented to make much sense beyond a point. Others would say that, yeah, maybe there is a majority, but is this really what that majority wants? This sort of anti-secular transformation of the republic, or do they disagree? Largely, perhaps, or are they concerned about other things? Do they have other things in their mind which they believe should take priority, and so on? The second thing is that Turkey has always been consistent with its authoritarian structure of governance and authority, a unitary and highly centralized state. So whoever controls the center or captures the center essentially has total power. And once Erdogan neutralized the military as an independent, actor during the last decade or so, he has total control of the Turkish state. But fortunately, we got from the 1950s onwards a moderately decentralized framework, which means that with quasi-federalization that has been happening bottom up from the 1990s onwards, especially, that power is much more diffused in India. That is why, to achieve national hegemony, states have to be one at a time, and then, even more important, retained. It won't suffice to kind of win a state and lose it a few years down the road and go back to square one. And the final difference between Turkey and India, Turkey has an extraordinary poverty of alternative forms of democratic thought because of the extreme preponderance of state centrism. It's called the devlet tradition, the all-powerful state, the personality cult of Atatürk, now replaced by the personality cult of Erdogan, and the zero-sum, winner-take-it-all, approach to politics, rather than a political system and a political culture that is based, as in democracies, including ours, on bargaining and compromise. Now, India has, by comparison, much more robust traditions of alternative, different forms, of political thought, of dissent. Attitudinally, I'm not sure that Indians are particularly attuned to the kind of anti-secular transformation of our republic, which would see India becoming a giant-sized version of Israel or Croatia or Sri Lanka. But let me end by saying that whatever happens, I will accept the verdict of the people as a democratic verdict. It's for them to decide. But a political minority, cannot, decide on its own. That is incompatible with our political system, with our political culture, and cannot and shall not be allowed to happen. Thank you.
Thank you.
Can I just ask Qudsiya, where is Qudsiya, to come and just deliver a brief vote of thanks. We are way behind time, but I hope the discussion was worth it. There is some tea outside.
So, thank you, audience, friends, authors, potential authors. All of you have been kind enough to attend today's event, which was, we thought, an unsuitable day and an unsuitable time, but we made it successful. A big thank you. Thank you to the team of editors, very passionate editors, Anisha, Rana and Shohini, for working on this book, and Sai for setting up this great show. The panel, of course, requires no mention. It was very passionate, and of course, passionate reaction from the audience as well. This is the kind of discussion that every publisher looks for. Professor Bose, thank you for writing this book. Even more wonderful that you published it with us. And I hope that this is just the beginning of a long relationship. Thank you, everyone.